hello to everybody out there. It's great to see people as you guys were registering. There's it'd be nice to say hello to a few clients of ours. So hi to Jenny Lee at Mizuho in New York, and Kate at United Biscuits in the UK, Susan at SAB in the UK. I know Peter at Megit is listening in Switzerland too, and to the guys in Capgemini in India. Great to have you guys on board, and to everybody else as well. We've got such a fabulous, diverse group from all around the world. I see people from Hong Kong and Vietnam. So if you've stayed up to listen to this, thank you very much. Otherwise, I'm assuming you might be listening to this on demand afterwards. Lots of guys from the US, from Colombia, from Germany and Switzerland, from Gambia and Nigeria. So a real great mix of people. And I'm really looking forward to listening to your ideas and your comments as we go through this too. So I'm going to hand over actually first of all to David, who's going to introduce this whole piece to us, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, well, thank you, Charlie, and thanks also to you, Andrew, for having us. We're really pleased here at HFI to be partnering with you at HCI on this topic. This is a fascinating topic to us here at HFI with our clientele really spread around the globe. It is a complex topic. There are no easy answers here. We're going to be presenting models and some knowledge base as we go through the hour. But the mindset to approach this in really is open-mindedness, non-judgmental, respect for the complexity of this and respect for the cross-cultural elements we're dealing with. Curiosity is the mindset I always try to come at this topic with. And yet at the same time, it is important to be very knowledgeable about specific details and differences, and to be able to be confident and decisive as a leader working in this situation, even though there is frequently a great deal of complexity and ambiguity. So we move on to the next slide here. We're going to make the claim that you'll have the whole world in your hands if you are thinking actively about this topic. Again, no easy answers, but engagement with the topic, being self-aware about where you're coming from culturally and about who you may be interacting with around the world. There is research that shows that this topic is more and more important, really essential for leadership. Companies that do not develop a self-awareness about global diversity run into problems. Smooth leadership transition really becomes a big problem when we're not paying attention to the cultural diversity we'll be addressing today. And there is definitely research showing that when companies do not pay close attention to this topic, there can be higher staff turnover, including at the executive level. Business performance goes down, market share goes down, stock valuations decline. One of the major models of leadership, which we think is very applicable to this topic and which we will explore a bit today, comes from the very well-known work of Hersey and Blanchard. They published a book called, they've published a number of books on the 1 Minute Manager, and the material we're presenting here is their leadership book on the 1 Minute Manager. And they call it situational leadership. So we're going to walk through this slide a bit to talk about different leadership styles. And this question at the top here, which is worth all of our reflecting on a bit as we go through this material. How do you prefer to work with your boss? It may not be the way you actually work with your boss, or the boss allows you to, but what's your preferred style? Now, situational leadership, I think, is relevant here. Hersey and Blanchard's book is not specifically focused on cultural diversity and global leadership, but I think it's very applicable because we get ourselves into very complex situations. And so this really is about situational leadership when we're thinking about working across national boundaries and across linguistic boundaries and other other factors that may divide us, but will hopefully bring us together with an empowering diversity. So take a look here. There are four different style types about how people like to work with their manager or their boss. Starting in the top right, there are certainly some of us who like to be coached. The coaching model really requires a boss or a manager who's very supportive and very directive. This is a hands-on style. Oftentimes, new employees, people with low confidence, or in some cases, people who aren't very motivated, really do need this kind of direction and support. Now, there are some people who prefer the directing style, where they're not necessarily asking for their boss to be emotionally supportive or even supportive of going through specific items of work, but they do want to be told what to do. So it's a hierarchical model in that sense. These are not strategic thinkers. These are more tactical and operational people that need to be told, this is what the company is doing, so please execute on task A, B, and C. Now, if we move over, let's go up to the supporting approach in the upper left quadrant. Here you are preferring a boss who is very supportive, is there to help whenever you want, to be a cheerleader in a sense. But it's people who like the supporting model don't need a lot of direction. They don't want to be told what to do or how to do it. They want to set their own priorities and their own workflow, and they may come up with creative ways to execute tasks. So they do want an involved and supportive boss, but they don't want to be told exactly how to accomplish the goals and execute on the tasks in a tactical fashion. And then finally, the delegating model. These are people who really prefer to have a boss who stays out of the way. People who are very competent, people who are highly motivated. These are almost entrepreneurial types of people working within organizations. They are fine with a boss who is hands-off. It's a collaborative, non-hierarchical model, and we call it the delegating model because the boss has handed over the task and the employee runs with it. Now, I hope as I've been talking some of that through and you've been looking at the slide, you're reflecting a bit on some of your own preferences and style approaches here. So we're going to do our first little poll. So, Andrew, if we can show that slide. There we go. How do you prefer to work with your boss? And the number of you have, it looks like all of you have already answered here. So let's go to the 46% first. That's the C. This is the group where the boss is going to largely leave it up to you, but provide some good support and encouragement. That is the supporting model. And it's changing. The poll numbers are changing. We're still seeing a high level. Ooh, now an equal level. Let's move it around a bit. We're seeing people who do like the supporting approach and who do like the directing approach at the highest levels here. So I think we have a global group, and as Charlie was mentioning, you're from many different countries all over the globe, more than 20 countries. But there is a preference here for the group in the middle, where the boss is going to give some guidance, support, and encouragement, but really leave it up to you as the individual to figure out how to get the work done. We're seeing a noticeable percentage, but a much smaller percentage of people who either want complete delegation and no involvement from the boss, or people who are going to want to be completely directed. That's the 6%. A, where the instructions are very explicit. So it's looking like the numbers are shifting around a bit less right now, and the majority of our group really prefer the supporting model, but there are a sizable number of you, about a third of you, who do like the directing model. So helpful for us to know, Charlie, as we go through the rest of this presentation, because we want to be able to adjust our comments and respond to your active involvement based on where you're coming from.
We'll definitely talk a little bit more about that too, and that situational leadership approach. So thanks, David. Some great points being pulled up there. I wanted to mention somebody right at the outset here when we're talking about leadership and the importance of leadership. Somebody that we've worked with for a number of years now. We've supported management selection, particularly in development at Starbucks, for several years. And so we've got a great chance to watch Howard Schultz as he's really demonstrated himself to be a great leader. And I think it's been really fascinating to watch what's happened since he essentially retired in 2000. He became non-executive chairman and really pulled himself out of the day-to-day of the Starbucks business in 2000. And then over the next 8 years, that business really lost its way. If you went into a Starbucks in the early 2000s, they were selling more cheese sandwiches than they were coffee, and they were growing just for the sake of growing. Lots of stores being opened, never had a chance of being profitable. And it was really fascinating to then watch him come back in his return in 2008 and his ability to refocus the corporation, really get back to the essence of what it was about and the experience of going into Starbucks, cutting back on the CD sales and other areas that they were getting involved in, and really focus back on the core of the business. They also closed a lot of the stores that were, even most of which had been opened very recently prior to his return. So his is a great story of the importance of decisive and visionary leadership in a very multicultural organization, and he's written a couple of books on it, and it's really worth having a look at that too. So I think he's a great inspiration in terms of somebody who's really been there and done it and come back and done it again, and I think that's what's been so impressive with him. But one of the challenges we have is that there's not that many Howard Schultz around. So a kind of question for you to just think about, not a poll question or anything, but maybe to just take a moment to reflect on. How is this war for talent working out for you? I'm pretty sure, certainly at the leadership level, you're finding that demand exceeds supply in your organizations. The war for talent definitely is alive and well, and it's a real challenge to find quality leadership candidates to join your organization. When you do, there's a lot of competition to get them on board, so they're probably looking at multiple offers, and it's a real minefield out there in terms of getting great leaders into your organization. A key question that might be worth thinking about for yourself, we're not just talking about CEOs here. Do you have a successor for your job? What happens when you get promoted? Is there somebody who's going to be able to step into your shoes? So one thing that we do know is that relying on external hiring is not the best approach. I'll give you an example, again, back up to the top. CEOs, corporations, the research we've got here is that corporations that hire CEOs from inside the organization, they tend to have a better success rate. So there's 30% less chance of the CEO leaving early. Those CEOs have a 10% higher productivity rate, and they start off, this is the average, $1 million less in initial compensation. So next time you're looking for a succession plan and you need budget for it, maybe one of the things to put in there is that a good succession plan is going to save you $1 million a year on at least on the CEO. So external hires definitely cost more. They take more time to get up to speed. They're more likely to leave. the answer then has to be that it's far better to maintain a healthy leadership pipeline. And the starting point for that has got to be a good, clear leadership model. That allows you to build your promotion management, build your succession plans, and manage leadership development and high potential programs. All of that requires you to know what good looks like. So that's what I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about here. We know that leadership comes in many forms. We've already talked about how you might like to work with your boss and seen that that varies for different people. Good looks different in different situations and in different organizations. We know that some leaders are born into a role. That doesn't necessarily make them a good leader, but it puts them in a position of leadership. Some are elected, some are trained. You can be autocratic or democratic. You can have a collective style or an individualistic style. There's all sorts of different approaches to leadership. And there's many paths to get there. But there's one thing that we do know, and that is that to lead well, to develop the ability to lead well, that's not something you're born with. It has to be learned. There are skills and knowledge that you have to learn in order to lead well. Some people are more naturally inclined to leadership. They find it easier to learn the skills. So we might say that they are a more natural leader. Others find it harder to develop those skills and capabilities. But nobody is born with a perfect leadership capability. Let's just have a look at that learning thing for a moment. At Human Factors, HFI here, we do a lot of work on assessment of individuals, and so we have a model that we base those kind of assessments on. And our model is our onion model. Why is it an onion? Well, so we've got multiple layers, and those layers are semi-translucent. You can see through them to an extent. So on the outside, we have behavior, how people are behaving. That's really easy to see. It's the outside layer. And you can see that how somebody's behaving just by watching them. The challenge there is that behavior changes a lot too. So how somebody behaves critically in a job interview is quite possibly very different to how they might behave at work. So we need to understand the inner layers of the onion to understand and be able to predict how somebody might behave in different situations. So as we progress in, knowledge is slightly harder to see. You have to ask questions. You can't just see somebody and tell how knowledgeable they are. It's also relatively easy to change. If they need to know more, then maybe they can go on a training course or read a book. We know that attitudes and values, they're harder to measure. We have to have some specific questionnaires for those. People, if you ask somebody what their attitudes and values are, it's not something we talk about that often, so it's something that you really have to think about before you're able to explain it. So we use some specialist questionnaires to pull that kind of information out. And also, values and attitudes take months and years to change. So they do change, but they change over a longer period of time. And then right at the core of the onion there, we're looking at our personality, our ability. These kind of things take some real specialist questionnaires. We use psychometric testing to really understand these kinds of things. And they don't really change for most of us after our mid to late 20s. So they do adapt and change in our childhood. But once we get into the workplace, for most of us, we are who we're going to be unless we go through some kind of traumatic experiences or something that really affects us in the long term. When we then start applying the leadership model to this, let's take an example. Let's take a single leadership behavior. Let's think about what we expect good leaders to do. Maybe we could say we expect good leaders to set clear goals. That seems like a sensible thing for good leaders to do. So when we look at who is likely to set clear goals, well, there are some personalities that are more in tune with being that kind of person. And when we look at our assessment approach, those of you who are familiar with 16PF, which is a tool that we use here, then we look at people who are dominant, task-focused, extrovert, confident, they have strong drive. These kind of people are more likely to naturally want to set goals for themselves and therefore for other people. So those are the kinds of people who are more naturally predisposed to be clear goal setters. But that's not enough. They also have to have the right kind of attitudes. They have to be motivated to want to achieve things and set goals. And they also have to know how to do it well. And this is where the knowledge and skills part comes in. They have to know what a good goal is. And that's why we do all these training around SMART goals and these kinds of things. They have to have some understanding of key performance indicators. They have to understand the business and what the business is trying to achieve and so forth as well. So it's only once you have all of these things together that you really have the potential for somebody who's going to be able to set clear goals. And of course, that's only one part of leadership. So here we understand that it's quite a complicated requirement when we say we want good leaders, and there's lots of parts of it altogether. Let me hand back over to David. I think he's got some comments to make around really the relationship here as well.
Well, thanks, Charlie. And I think my comments are intended to be a segue from what Charlie was just saying about knowledge, values, attitude, personality, and let's sort of swing the pendulum back toward thinking about it in the global diversity model that we've begun to explore. All of this is based on context. So you may have a certain personality or ability that will work well for you as a leader in one situation, but won't work as well in another. Certain behaviors that may work extremely well in New York City are not going to work quite as well in Hong Kong or Berlin or in Africa. So nothing is absolute about these models. It has to be put in context, and this is one of the reasons why we at HFI are so interested in cultural diversity. We want to take our model for assessment of leaders and how to train leaders and be able to key it well to the different contexts. So really think about it in terms of a global situation. A great leader is somebody who leads, but leaders need followers. Everybody can't be a leader. There do have to be some followers, and effective leadership depends on the relationship between the two and on the cultural surrounding situation that we're talking about. So here's an example. There's an Australian leader. He's one of the guys, one of the mates, and in Australia doesn't like to show off his status. It's a more flat, collaborative model, not hierarchical. And so he goes not too far away, but he goes to Japan for a meeting. And when he gets there, he asks to rent a car. And he just wants a relatively inexpensive, unassuming car, a regular person car. Now, in Australia, this would be an admired leadership behavior because he's one of the mates. And people shouldn't distinguish them so much by that sort of external status or style. But in Japan, or at least a predominant attitude in Japan, may be that the boss, this particular person, shouldn't be driving around in a car that's not as high quality or high price as other people. The boss should have the best car. So an appropriate leadership behavior, an effective leadership behavior in Australia may not play as well in Japan. Just sort of a mundane example, but think about it in your own work across cultures. Where does that come up? Where one particular style works extremely well somewhere and then just does not play as well in other areas. We may think of extroverts with a big personality and a great sense of humor. That may work very well in a business meeting. Over a few drinks in Chicago, it may not play as well in the Philippines or in Guatemala City. So moving right along here on the same theme, we've placed McDonald's in a very clearly Asian context here to just highlight how stark the differences in image and in the reality of how companies function can be. Now, so much of this research on effective leadership and effective management styles has been done in the U.S. More is being done outside of the West, not just in North America or Western Europe anymore, but so much of it has been done here. So as I was mentioning at the very beginning, we're still working in a context of significant uncertainty, but we are beginning to get a bit of more detailed, even quantitative understanding about how some of these leadership style differences make quite a difference in terms of how they play out in different situations. So here's an example: national differences, country and percentage, as we move to the next slide. The question, which as we go on to the next slide, it's going to be a question, but we're also going to show some data across countries. So here's the question: should your leader, your boss, have a precise answer to questions that you might ask concerning your work? Okay, so kind of a yes or no. And voting is still coming in. We're seeing a somewhat predominance of no's. Looks like the numbers are settling down into a 60-40. So a small majority of you are not expecting that your boss, leader, manager is going to have a precise answer. Now we're at 50-50. A few more votes coming in. This is like watching election returns on CNN in the recent presidential primaries here in the U.S. It's high suspense. Well, I think we're seeing a pretty even split. The numbers may be settling down here, but regardless, I think we're seeing a pretty even split. Oh, now it's about a 2/3, 1/3. But so again, the question here is: should your leader have a precise answer to questions that you may ask concerning your work? The percentages that we see across different countries and cultures really can vary. We're seeing it in this group. Now, we're not breaking out with this very international group today how it's breaking down by country, but we do have some research showing that in a country like Japan, most people, 78%, actually do want the leader to have a precise answer. And at the very opposite end of the spectrum, in the Netherlands, it's 17%. We may go back to our own survey in a moment just to see how all the voting settled out, but take a look at the spectrum here. Again, a huge majority in Japan or Indonesia are looking for direction from the boss, from the leader. And then if we move over to the Netherlands, US, Denmark, UK, the numbers are much lower. It's a very different kind of relationship with the leader. And it has a major impact on how leaders should think about their approach, their style in different cultures, which we will continue on talking about. Should we just return once more to the poll for this group? I would think all the voting is in now. Let's just see how it finally came out. Okay. A full 2/3 of you are not expecting a definitive, clear answer always from the boss, and but 1/3 would like that kind of direction. Okay, so thank you for voting there. We'll continue on, Charlie.
So the answers to that question may be partly cultural, may be partly individual, and may also be contextual. How you feel about how clear the answer from your boss may, of course, depend on the question you're asking. So, but mostly, in most cases, for people in the US, the predominant culture is to have a desire to be involved in the discussion rather than be told the answer. So that's obviously what most people in the US feel. In other cultures, South America, for example, it's quite common for people to want much clearer answers. That's what the leader is for. That's what they expect. So it's worth thinking about that when you are dealing with different kinds of people, that they may not have the same expectations that you have. And here's an interesting one, just thinking about meetings. So I find that the more senior people I talk to, the more meetings they have to be involved in. So meetings are a real common challenge. And when we talk about cross-cultural situations, meetings are run very differently. So if you saw a meeting agenda like this, if this was sent to you, it looks like a pretty normal kind of meeting agenda to me. We've got three main items telling us where we're going to be and what time. I'd be interested to know what you guys think this meeting would actually be trying to achieve. Now, again, I think this is going to be very culturally dependent. So you've got an opportunity to vote on this one too. Really, three options. Choose whichever is the closest to the one you feel most appropriate. Do you think that this meeting is really about reviewing and agreeing actions for each of the items on the agenda? Or do you think it's more of a discussion about approaches to budgeting, about some other related things? Or do you think it's maybe not even really so much about that, but more about identifying areas of conflict and disagreement? So I'd be interested to know what you guys are thinking. Andrew's taking us across here to have a look at this, and I'm sure these numbers are going to shift around too, but for me, this is a really fascinating thing because meetings are such an important part of our day-to-day life in work and business, and the fact that, look at this, we've got 42% of people saying that the real aim here is to agree actions for each of the items, whereas a lot more people are saying it's more about a discussion about the approach to budgeting, about related things, so much broader than the specific agenda is actually showing. Nobody at the moment, I haven't got anybody on my screen at least, saying that they think this is more about conflict or disagreement. I think I would get a very different answer if I was asking that. Oh, we've got a few people coming on now saying that. I think we'd get a very different viewpoint if we asked this of a predominantly Japanese or Chinese culture. I think there's often a lot higher in that C category in terms of looking for discourse and problems before you start getting into solutions. So that's actually not changing too much, reasonably settled down. We're getting a few more people at the top there saying that they think that this is more about agreeing actions, but the predominant is still for looking at and discuss a broad approach or a broad discussion around budgeting. Let me show you a slide with some models on it, which might just be helpful for you thinking about this. I've got three different approaches to these kind of meetings, and they are broadly culturally dependent. So we find in Northern Europe, places like Germany, UK, the US as well, we have very linear cultures when it comes to these kinds of things. So normally the expectation in a meeting is to tackle each agenda point one by one and solve them. So in the case of our agenda that we just looked at, first point on the agenda is last month's expenditure, actual versus forecast. We might sit down and have a conversation about last month's expenditure, come up with any actions that are required, and then move on to the next topic, regarding that topic as essentially complete and finished. That differs quite wildly when we look at a more South American or Mediterranean Europe or an Arab kind of approach, which is much more discussive. It's a more multi-active kind of approach and that we seem to be getting the predominant answers just now to this question, is usually to have more of a broad discussion and explore the general approach. Maybe the agenda is a guideline more than something to specifically walk through. And often at the end of meetings in those kind of places, the conclusions are not directly linked necessarily to the agenda. They might be quite broad, the conclusions. When we look at more reactive kind of cultures, as we find often in parts of Asia, then the meetings might be more concerned about where potential discord might be. So it would be more, rather than stepping through each agenda item to solve it, it's more looking at where the conflict might be and understanding what issues people might have before later on kind of trying to pull to a consensus view. So again, a very different way of running a meeting, and something that's really valuable when you're involved in these kind of multicultural situations. So I think it highlights specifically if you're, for example, a German, or as I am, a British manager going into a meeting that's predominantly maybe Latin American, recognizing that it's going to run differently is pretty important. And that goes right down to quite specific levels. Here I've got a question for you, no poll, but just to have in your head, back to the budget meeting that we were looking at. What time do you think you would actually start this meeting? What time do you think you would really be talking about the business of the meeting as opposed to just saying hello? And do you think that would vary depending on where in the world you were? There's been some great research on this, and I'm going to pull out an extract from a superb book by Lewis on cultural differences, and he's a linguist, so he looks at it really from a language point of view, but his research has spread from there. And he did some work on when meetings start. And look at the differences here. In Germany, the meeting starts within about 3 minutes. Formal introduction, sit down, okay, let's get on with it. The US is pretty quick too, but it's more of an informal introduction. There's usually a couple of jokes at the beginning, and then we get into it, and away we go. The UK, and I can absolutely vouch for this, takes a little bit longer to get into it. It usually takes about 10 minutes of talking about the weather, talking about how awful the traffic was on the way to the meeting. And then there's usually some kind of excuse as to, I guess we really have to get around to this business. So it's almost apologetic that you actually have to do some work. So that usually takes about 10 minutes to get into a meeting. In France, it's kind of similar, but the small talk tends to be around politics and scandal and what's gone wrong in the world. So slightly different start. Japanese take a little while too. There has to be some time to just exchange pleasantries and so on. Japanese meetings tend to start very suddenly when the senior Japanese person just calls a halt to the whole thing and says, okay, the matter at hand is, and away you go. And then I think my favorite is the Latin American kind of cultures, and this is actually very similar in Arabic places too. There's lots of discussion, but the actual meeting time is not that specific. People get caught up doing all sorts of other things, and so they take a lot longer to actually start these meetings. And usually you're talking about soccer and so forth, and then eventually, once everybody finally gets in the room, you might start probably about half an hour late. Just changing thought a bit here. So we've talked about lots of differences of culture. Who copes well with those? One of the things that we find we get involved in a lot is assessing senior managers for the potential for them to go and work in expat roles. We actually find that very few people are really lined up to work well in different cultures. We divide people into 3 groups. There are those people who, as you can see from the short arrow there, they can work in their own culture. So even moving from California to Washington is a bit of a challenge for them, but they can probably just about cope with that. they're the kind of stay-at-home leaders. They can be great leaders in their own culture, but take them out of their own culture and they struggle. You also get people who can work in similar cultures, so maybe they can move from the US to the UK or Northern Europe and they'll get on fine, but they rarely have an issue with, for example, meetings that don't start on time or something along those lines. And then there's a very few people around who can actually work in any culture and maybe move all the way to China and be able to get on well. So they're a little bit more challenging to find, and it really comes down to personality characteristics as well as skills and experience. So essentially, one of the key lessons that a lot of our clients have found over the last few years is it is a lot easier to develop local leaders than it is to ship leaders out from your home country. But that does, of course, bring up the very topic that we're talking about in terms of understanding and adapting global leadership.
Well, pick it up from there, Charlie, and again, following up on that point, what we find with the assessments and then follow-up with HFI clients is that some people are much more capable of flexing or adapting their style to new situations than others. That's true across all leadership dimensions and in particular across the various cultural dimensions. Now, as I said at the beginning, we've got to keep an open mind and curiosity about this because there are no universal truths here. People are complex and all of this is context dependent. There's no 100% truth across the board in each of these cultural situations, and we don't want to, go too far down the road of caricaturing. But there is more and more research that is indicating that these models are useful, that some of the data about cultural difference, the data are valid, they are applicable. And so let's talk a little bit about one of the really key models that's worth spending a few minutes on. It was developed by Dutch professor Geert Hofstede. And there are 4 different characteristics. Huge amounts of quantitative research went into this in the 1960s and 1970s, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of questionnaires that led Professor Hofstede to break down 4 different leadership characteristics that are relevant, and in particular are relevant in the cross-cultural context. So I'm going to mention what those 4 are. Time permitting, we'll be able to go through some of the details, and then the slides that you can follow up on have even more detail than we'll have time to get into in the hour. So the 4 characteristics he talked about are collectivism versus individualism. Second one is this question about power distance. Third is uncertainty avoidance. And then fourth is masculine characteristics versus feminine characteristics. So the first one is uncertainty avoidance. And this is the question about to what degree can you as a leader, what degree as you as a worker in a company deal with ambiguity and unpredictability. And societies really vary on this in a major way. And then the companies that are doing business or based in those companies are reflecting what the society experiences. So the uncertainty avoidance index in Denmark is very low. In Belgium, it's very high. So the uncertainty avoidance index is defined as a society's tolerance for ambiguity. A low degree on this index shows that there's more acceptance of differing ideas, thoughts, ambiguity, complexity, all of those things. And so you see that in Denmark, much less in Belgium. And then there are many countries, as you can see on the slide, where there's more intermediate scores, reflecting a higher degree of diversity or flexibility on this particular question about ambiguity and unpredictability. Next is masculine versus femininity. You were going to say a few words about that, Charlie.
Yeah, sure. This one's an interesting topic. The name sometimes gets people a little concerned about what it's going to talk about, but it's really about whether a society prefers or pushes for assertive heroism for being successful. Is it about really trying to achieve things, or is it more about cooperating and caring and quality of life? And we find, for example, in Scandinavian countries, much more of an approach to being caring for members of the society, whereas in places like Venezuela and Japan, where it's a lot more around success and we're actually trying to achieve things. So interesting kind of differences there, and this is not about individualism versus collectivism. This is about the whole society and whether it's trying to be successful or really what it values as most important within the society.
Power distance, a similar interesting data here, and a very wide spread. The countries where there's a high power distance score, they desire, they prefer hierarchy. They want decisions made at the top, and then they're filtered down in a directive way toward the bottom. Guatemala has a very high score at 95 out of 100. Then countries at the far opposite end of the spectrum do not want top-down decision-making or power hierarchies. They're much more collaborative, distributed networks of power and control. Israel and Denmark fall into that category of very low levels of on the power distance score. And then many countries right in the middle, including where Charlie comes from and where I come from, U.S. and the U.K., 35 in the U.K., 40 in the U.S. So a little more ambiguous there. But the data really are robust, and they show a very wide range on this. And also the fourth and final one is individualism versus collectivism. Question about whether people like to work alone and decide alone, or work closely together in groups with high levels of cohesion and community orientation. So Guatemala, very low on this, much more of a collective, community-oriented culture. The U.S. high at 91, much more of a focus on the I rather than the we when it comes to decision-making and how people work together in teams. Many countries in the middle, but again, the wide distribution of scores is showing that there's something very robust going on here.
I'm getting a little flag here saying that we're pushing our time a little, so I don't want to hold you guys back too much, but I just want to run through briefly an actual practical approach to developing and really making the most of the kind of work that we've been looking at here. The starting point is having some kind of talent management model. We are big proponents of the Crossroads model that was developed within GE and was made famous as the great book, The Leadership Pipeline by Stephen Drodder and Ram Charan. But it doesn't really matter what your model is. The key is that you have to understand at each of these kind of levels within your organization, what does leadership really mean and what does it look like? And then you have to try and work out what are you going to do, because we are saying that actual leadership behavior is not universal, that it varies across cultures. So what I find most organizations doing is writing down a list of behaviors that, for example, a function leader should be undertaking. And the challenge with that is it doesn't leave any room for individual differences or cultural differences. So the alternative approach there is, and this is where we start to get swings and pendulums, is to go from that very centralized, here is our model for the whole organization, to the other end of decentralized, we won't have a universal model. Every single part of our business, every region can have their own approach to leadership, and we'll allow them to do as they wish. Of course, that is great in terms of being very accepting of different leadership styles, but it doesn't allow any cross-training or development. It makes it hard for people to move around the organization. There is an equilibrium in the middle. So that equilibrium in the middle is very much around having a model that looks at the capabilities that are required and then behaviors that are more regionally focused. So, for example, and this is an example coming from just a couple of behavioral descriptions coming out of a leadership model that we have around maybe the capabilities around team building. In the US, that what we expect of a leader is that they put their team goals before their own. That's a very important part of team building. Whereas in Mexico, it actually might be more around personal lives, and that the leader demonstrates that real strong interest in the members. I've got another example there around empowering and motivating, that the US tends to expect leaders to use open questioning to build on others' ideas. That is a challenge in some cultures where they expect the leader to have answers, not questions. So in India, for example, the way you get across strong leadership is to communicate your own knowledge and experience and provide nice, clear direction for people. And so very different approaches, but in both cases, you need to be empowering and motivating. We tend to, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on how we do this kind of piece, but we'll use things like critical incident interviews, repertory grid analysis. That's a great one to look up. It's a interview technique that's developed by psychologists that really helps to get to the root of what good looks like for your organization. And what you end up with is, as I say, a standardized set of capability areas, but with regionally focused behaviors that once you've got that deep understanding, allows you to really build your talent pipeline, whether it's through selecting the right people in or promoting the right people or helping to develop those people too. And so that essential model then allows you to build on it with 9-box grids, succession plans, all these kind of good things that we're able to do. But the basis of it has to be that flexible model. So that's taking us to just wrapping up. And I know I kind of sprinted through that last bit a little bit, so we might have some questions on that. I want to leave at least a couple of minutes for that. But essentially what we're trying to do through this is ensure that we've got leaders that are aligned to the cultures they're working in, and that might be that they're expats working in a different culture, or it might be that they're local managers and leaders working in their own cultures, but within a broader global model for the organization. Once we start to allow that kind of flexibility, then that gives us larger talent pools to select from. We're more accepting of different approaches to leadership, and it gives us more diverse leaders. And that, of course, is definitely going to be a good thing for the organization as a whole. So that's a very quick wrap up. Andrew, I hope we've covered all the topics in enough detail for our listeners here to understand, but I'd like to hand over to you and see if any questions are coming through, or if there's anything particular that you think we needed to cover again.
Certainly. Well, first, let me thank you, Charlie and David. This has been fantastic. I think this is all the more reason why this is a topic that obviously can't be, resolved in a 45-minute presentation, but you've certainly piqued our interest. And I think that there's a lot of ancillary topics that we can connect with you on, and I would encourage our members to engage with HFI if there's anything that you feel might be of interest. They have an ebook available for more information, so we can make that available to you. And of course, I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and ask any questions that we may be able to pass to our presenters offline and connect you so that you'll be able to get specific and maybe perhaps even more detailed answers than we would have had we been able to get to as many as we can. So I'll just ask, Charlie and David, just one quick takeaway question here before we conclude. what is it that you would say is the quick win for people in terms of what you'd like them to get a better sense of following today's presentation?
Well, I would start with self-awareness, and that in a very specific form that might mean sitting down for 5 or 10 minutes a day and putting down on paper 2 or 3 situations which maybe could benefit from a little bit more thought with regard to a client from another country or some kind of cultural difference on your team. So to think through just to identify where there may be some problem areas, develop some self-awareness about your own preferred style, and then so almost with the sort of empathy, try to think about it from the other person's style or cultural standpoint. And that may end up leading to a conversation or some behavior change.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. Again, a big thank you to HFI for making this webcast possible. And let's get the biggest thank you of all extended to each and every one of our HCI members, both new and returning to the webcast platform. We encourage you to look for more information on this and other topics on our website. And we wish you a great rest of the day. Take care, everybody, and let's make the most of it.